So what we're going to talk about a little bit is this statement: Americans don't lead well anymore. A lot of times you hear speakers tell you that, and the question is whether you believe it or not. You see it in a lot of cases, and there's a lot of data that would tell you it might be true. And the kinds of things you see come and challenge us aren't things we can always prevent, but how we deal with them often determines how effective we are as leaders, as individuals and groups of leaders. And the question is why? Have we gotten lazy? Have we gotten stupid? Have we lost our edge? And it's a fair question. And really, I'm not sure that's the case. I think maybe we were successful is the problem. For many years, we were very, very successful in business, in politics, in sports, in war. And we thought we knew the rules. We knew how it worked, how the system worked. We knew what it took to make it work and be successful. And then some things changed. There was more competition. Things happened more quickly than they ever had before. It was more complex. And the organizations and structures we dealt with weren't quite as disciplined. So suddenly, all of the things that had defined the environment in which we operate changed to the point where there was a problem. There was a capability gap, a leadership gap. The sport we had been playing suddenly wasn't good enough for the sport we were required to be effective at. And that's where it came out with what I do now. I work with something called cross-lead because it's something I feel very strongly about in how organizations and individuals can operate better. And I didn't come to this from an experience in business. I came to this with a shared experience in special operating forces in the U.S. In April of 1980, it was really a date that changed the rest of my career. And for those of you who remember the failure of Operation Eagle Claw in the desert in Iran, Jimmy Carter's bold decision to launch forces to try to rescue American citizens held hostage in the embassy in Tehran failed when two aircraft doing ground taxi ran into each other, and tragically 8 Americans were killed. And the mission ended in failure. And if you remember, that was 5 years after failure in Vietnam, 4 years after the Israelis had been successful in Entebbe. And for American Special Operating Forces, it was deeply embarrassing because we'd been called upon by the nation to get something done and failed. And instead of everybody finger pointing and feeling bad about it, inside there was a decision made that said that won't happen again. We won't be asked to perform this kind of difficult task and fail. And so very quickly things started in some pretty amazing organizations. Some had existed before and some were founded new. World-class organizations to give America the capability. And they were very successful. For a number of years, a succession of problems around the world were dealt with by special operating forces that did great things. But sometimes when you do great things inside organizations, you can become very self-confident. And the cohesion that you have internally can become tribal. And you can become stovepiped. It can be very difficult to get very successful organizations actually to cooperate with each other because they're so successful, nobody else is worthy to cooperate with them. And so what was happened is an organization was formed in 1981 to pull all of those together, the Joint Special Operations Command. And this is to create a team of teams. And it was extraordinarily effective, but it was very narrowly focused. And if you think back in those days, most of the requirements were hostage rescue, hijackings, and things like that, response to pretty discrete terrorist acts around the world to protect Americans and our allies. But then things changed. They really started changing before 9/11, but we in the country and in the world really woke up after 9/11. And we realized we had a different problem. And that problem was culturally hard to understand, and it was geographically dispersed. It wasn't in one spot. And it wasn't the kind of organization, Palestinian Liberation Organization, Black September, that we'd grown up with and focused on. And it was dynamic, and it was morphing, it was changing every month. And it operated differently. For those of you who remember some of the early hijackings, an aircraft would be hijacked, and the hijackers would make some demands. We want money, or we want people released from jail, or that sort of thing. Now we had organizations that simply crashed the aircraft or blew things up without making demands, just making statements. How do you feel about that? The world's changed. So suddenly the requirement was different. to do our part for the nation, we had to deal with a threat that was wider. It was networked and it was aggressive. And we had a very narrow, focused organization that had been designed to deal with it. And so what we had was a gap. So what do you do when you have a gap and you don't have all the capability that you need? We identified we need to go wider. We needed to go to partner nations. We needed to go to other parts of the U.S. government, the intelligence community, Treasury, Federal Bureau of Investigation, that sort of thing. We need to get all of these elements and bring the capabilities that they have into the task force. And the task force that I was put in command of pulled parts of all of these organizations together. So you got a big problem, you share it with people, problem solved. Unless you've ever tried to do that. We used to talk about cultural differences. How are we going to speak to the Iraqis? How are we going to speak to the Egyptians? Hell, how are we going to speak to the State Department? You're trying to form an organization out of people and organizations that it's very different, because I didn't command them. All these people were in my task force. About 10% were actually people that were on my books. I didn't legally command them. I didn't pay them and whatnot. And so we had to change the way we operated. And yet we'd grown up with this model. We'd all grown up with the traditional organization, somebody at the top, 2 to 7 subordinates, 2 to 7 below that, because organizational theory says that's what works. And in where I spent some time in the Pentagon, that is then translated to physical spaces. So we take this organization hierarchy, we give people office spaces. If you're very important, you get a private office. If you're very, very important, you get an assistant in front of your office. We called them moat dragons. And the only purpose was to keep information from getting in there, because we didn't want to taint information from senior people, their decisions, with clarity. Does that feel familiar? All right. And that's a very real problem, because again, you go back to here's the organizational structure we all knew and we grew up with and we were taught in school, worked, and for many generations it actually was very successful. And then in our counter-terrorist world, we came against an enemy that wasn't using this, hadn't gotten the memo that they had to fight this way. And so we had to change our structure to become a network. And the difference was, instead of the decisions being made where people were wisest and most senior, we found decisions had to be made where people were wisest, which was usually closer to the problem. So the challenge was for everyone in the organization to share information to the point where we had this shared consciousness, understanding of the context, and then people could operate with what we call smart autonomy. Very, very common term, very, very instructive. Now, how do you do that? The first thing you do is go, no problem solving it. But what do we typically do when we have a problem like this? In our world, you do what you already do well and you try to do it better. You try to shoot better, you try to work harder, you try to fly faster. And guess what? At a certain point, you hit physics. You just can't do it any better. And that's really what we hit about 2004. We were doing things and we were doing it better and better and better. And guess what? Even when we were doing better and better, we weren't winning. And that's a military euphemism for we're losing. So we had to change. You had to change what you were doing. So we came upon this. The only way we could actually get better was to get shared consciousness and purpose. Now, if I had briefed this to the people that I grew up with and I was serving with, big red ball with shared consciousness, they'd have beat me up and taken my lunch money. Because that's just not the kind of thing that is comfortable for this kind of world, big knuckle guys. But at the end of the day, we backed into realizing that was actually the solution. And it comes down into a construct. Everything's got 3 parts. It breaks into design. There's an execute part, and then, of course, a lead part. And each part needed to be understood. The first part, the design part, was interesting because design determines where you're going to get it right. I knew that this organization or this group has a bunch of naval history enthusiasts. So I brought out the Battle of Trafalgar to explain this. If I bore you because you know it all, stop me. October '05, 33 French and Spanish ships of the line, the most complex engines of any type in the world at that time, up against 27 ships of the line under General or Admiral Horatio Nelson. That's about a 20% difference. Admiral Nelson had been trying to get this combined enemy fleet into battle for about 2 years, and he finally got them. And you see there's the French and Spanish line is on the right side, up, down, and then you see 2 columns that Admiral Nelson is going to attack into, and you say, well, that's a pretty good plan. He's going to go and he's going to cut them in pieces. Until you look at 19th century naval technology, all of the firepower's on the sides, it's broadsides. So what you do is, as he's sailing into this, the French and Spanish can engage his ships for about 30 minutes before his ships get close enough to return a single round. Now you go, maybe not such a good plan. The night before the battle, he gave this guidance to his captains. And what he's saying is, this is going to get difficult, it's going to get confusing. I trust you to get close and figure it out. At the very beginning, once his ship, which was leading one of the columns, got close enough, Admiral Nelson was hit by a sniper, mortally wounded, and died 2 hours and 45 minutes later. He had no impact on the battle, yet at the end of it, 22 of the 33 enemy ships were captured or destroyed without the loss of a single British ship. He won the battle, not in the fight, he won the battle by shaping his force, by making them competent and confident and able to operate. So he won it long before they got there. And then there's execute, disciplined execution. This is Mike Bloomberg. This is where he runs New York City from. Not in a private office. I was there talking to him. I said, okay, Mike, show me the real office. That's it. Because information flows. Same way I operated in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the leadership part. Sometimes we say if we get the design right, we get this process right, it'll run itself and you don't really need leaders. That's absolutely the opposite of what I learned. When you've got a good strategy and a thing, you need an inspirational leader. As good as the civil rights movement strategy was, and it was brilliant, without Martin Luther King and other leaders, there's no way you'd have had the moral courage to continue on with it. And so as we lead organizations, you can't just get the design right and then be in an ivory tower while it runs itself, at least not what I saw. And I think as Martin Luther King said, you've got to mold the consensus of your organization. So what works and what doesn't work? This is just my experience. The first thing is traditional decision making in the military where you do it hierarchical down, doesn't work. It's too slow and it also doesn't produce the right answer often. Doesn't get enough information. Shared consciousness and purpose where everybody understands the context and can make the decision locally does work. Information ownership. Look at the different, information's power. You've got information, you dole it out in bits and pieces, people pay you for it or whatever. It makes you more powerful. It makes the organization weaker. In October of '07, we captured this big trove of al-Qaeda documents in northern Iraq in a place called Sinjar. And we wanted to get this out to the partner nations we were working with, Libya and others, so we could stop the flow of young men, basically, as foreign fighters into Iraq. And I said, well, how do we give this to them? And my intelligence officer says, well, we captured it. You're the classification authority. I said, okay, what's that going to do? He says, just make it unclassified. Just say it's not classified, just give it out, which is what we did. And a lot of the intel community had a conniption, but I'd already done it. And it got out there, and suddenly the information had value because people could use it. Organizational equities, that's where you're watching out for your organization, either part of an organization or a large organization. Unfortunately, you only succeed as a big team. There's a thing that says all the different parts of a team can be effective, but it won't matter. If everybody on a baseball team has a high batting average, but you lose, you lost. And finally, command and control, that's really more hierarchical structures and decision-making process. That's the way the military calls it. What works is trust. I'm going to take you through that again because those of you who didn't get it down the first time. And this is what I believe. I don't think you're born as a leader. I think you decide to be one. And I've got a few minutes and I'll entertain any questions that you might have. Thank you.